Hey guys. Tonight, let's do something nice and low effort together. Go ahead and dim the lights, put your phone face down, loosen your jaw, unclench whatever part of your body you've been clenching since 2014. Tonight, we're easing into the American Revolution, not the fireworks version, not the heroic painting where everyone looks handsome, brave, and weirdly moisturized. No. Tonight is the slow, awkward, emotionally constipated version, the one where most of the main characters are rich, tired, annoyed, and deeply convinced that they are the smartest person in every room. This is not the story of a people suddenly rising up. It's more like a long group chat argument that got out of hand, one that lasted years and ended with a country. Because of course it did. So let's drift back to the early 1700s, colonial America, a place that is already uncomfortable, muddy, loud, and full of opinions. The American colonies were not starving peasants in rags. They were, for the most part, doing fine. Annoyingly fine. The coastal elites lived in big houses. They owned land, they owned people, they wore powdered wigs in humid weather, which tells you everything you need to know about their priorities. They considered themselves British. Very British. British. They drank British tea, they read British newspapers, they complained about Britain constantly, which is, frankly, extremely British behavior. And for a long time, Britain barely noticed them, which was exactly how everyone liked it. England was busy doing empire things, fighting wars, collecting colonies like trading cards, spending money it absolutely did not have. Then came the 7 Years' War. Or, as the colonies experienced it, a massive, expensive mess that Britain technically won. Victory, however, came with a bill, a very large bill. And Britain did what governments always do when the money runs out. They looked around and said, "Who hasn't been paying enough taxes?" Their eyes slowly drifted west, across the ocean, toward the colonies. Now, from Britain's perspective, this made sense. They had protected the colonies from France. They had troops stationed there. They had ships. They had debt. From the colonies' perspective, this was deeply rude. Because the colonies had gotten used to being ignored. They had their own assemblies, their own local power structures, their own petty feuds and grudges. They did not want supervision. They especially did not want paperwork. So Britain introduced new taxes. Nothing outrageous at first, just stamps, paper, tea. And the colonial elites lost their minds. Quietly at first, then loudly, then dramatically. They began repeating a phrase that would echo forever: no taxation without representation, which sounds very noble, very democratic, very poster-ready. What it actually meant was, we did not want to pay taxes unless we get a seat at the table. Not everyone should vote, not freedom for all, just we would like more influence, please. And Britain said no, in the calm, distant way that empires say no, which made everything worse. Let's float gently over to the people who will eventually become famous, men whose faces now stared down from currency, men who were, at the time, just exhausting. Let's start with George Washington. Yes, that George Washington. He was tall, he was quiet, he was deeply concerned with his image at all times. Washington was not born into royalty, but he desperately wanted to look like someone who might be. He practiced standing correctly. He practiced speaking calmly. He practiced not showing emotion, which he would later pass off as leadership. He also wanted land, a lot of land. He wanted Western land. British restrictions on westward expansion annoyed him greatly. This was not about freedom. This was about real estate. Washington also had terrible teeth, constant pain, dentures that did not fit, a simmering irritation that never really left him, which explains a lot. Then there was John Adams, short, loud, opinionated, a man who could never just let a thought pass by quietly. Adams was deeply intelligent and deeply convinced that everyone else was wrong. He believed in independence early. He also believed that people were generally terrible, including the people he was fighting for. Adams did not trust democracy. He trusted structure, rules, balance. He was the kind of man who would absolutely correct you during a bedtime story. Then we have Thomas Jefferson, tall, soft-spoken, extremely into philosophy. Jefferson wrote beautifully about liberty. He also enslaved hundreds of people and spent his life avoiding that contradiction as hard as humanly possible. Jefferson loved France. He loved wine. He loved quiet reflection. He hated confrontation. When things got uncomfortable, Jefferson tended to leave the country, which, again, explains a lot. Now, these men did not all agree, not even close. They argued constantly. They wrote letters complaining about each other. They formed factions. They sulked. But they shared one thing. They were tired of being told what to do by people 3,000 miles away. And Britain kept doubling down, because why not? New laws, more enforcement, troops in cities. British soldiers were stationed in Boston, which made everyone uncomfortable. Colonists did not like standing armies. Soldiers did not like being glared at by angry merchants. Tensions rose. Voices got louder. Pamphlets appeared. Pamphlets were the Twitter of the 18th century. Everyone had one. Everyone was mad. Somebody was always exposing the truth. Then, inevitably, something went wrong. The Boston Massacre, a name that already tells you we're dealing with some branding choices. It was chaotic, confusing, a street confrontation. Shots fired, people killed. It was not a massacre in the modern sense, but it felt like one. And feelings matter more than facts when you're building a movement. The colonies leaned into outrage. Britain leaned into authority. No one backed down, because backing down is for reasonable people. Then came the tea, the infamous tea. The Tea Act was meant to help the British East India Company. It actually made tea cheaper. But the principle, the principle. Colonial elites saw this as a trap, a slippery slope, a precedent. So they dressed up as Native Americans, because subtlety was never the goal. And they dumped tea into the harbor, a very expensive tantrum. Britain responded with punishment, closing ports, restricting self-government. The colonies responded by calling these the intolerable acts, which is a strong word for laws, but emotions were running high. Now, here's the important part. At this stage, most colonists did not want independence. They wanted compromise. They wanted to be heard. They wanted Britain to chill out. But once things start moving, they rarely slow down. Meetings were held, Congress assembled, letters were sent. And slowly, reluctantly, the idea of independence crept in, like a thought you're not supposed to think, but keep thinking anyway. Thomas Paine entered the scene, a man with absolutely no chill. His pamphlet, Common Sense, was loud, direct, accessible. It did something dangerous. It made independence sound normal, not radical, not insane, just logical. Once that happened, there was no going back. People picked sides, families split, neighbors stopped speaking, and still many hoped it wouldn't come to war. They were wrong. By the time fighting began, it felt almost accidental, a series of misunderstandings, miscalculations, bad timing.
Shots fired at Lexington and Concord, no one entirely sure who fired first, and suddenly the situation was no longer theoretical. The leaders scrambled to catch up with events. They were not ready. They were not unified. They were improvising. The Continental Army was a mess, undertrained, undersupplied, frequently cold. Washington took command because someone had to, and because he looked good on a horse. He struggled constantly with discipline, with morale, with his own doubts. Behind the scenes, Congress argued about money, about authority, about everything. And still, independence had not been officially declared. That came later, after months of conflict, after it was already very awkward to pretend reconciliation was possible. Jefferson was tasked with writing the Declaration.
Welcome back. Glad you're still here. Hopefully you didn't learn anything too energizing since last time. If you did, just let it drift away. This is not that kind of history. Last time, we left our extremely stressed group of colonial elites standing at the edge of a very real war they absolutely did not plan properly. They had declared independence, they had angered the largest empire on Earth, and now they had to somehow survive the consequences of their own confidence, which is always the tricky part. So let's settle back into the late 1770s. The Continental Army exists now. Technically, it is not impressive. It is cold, it smells bad. It is mostly made up of farmers who were told this would be quick. George Washington is in charge, which sounds comforting until you remember that he has never led an army this large before or fought a war like this, or had to convince thousands of half-trained men not to go home when winter arrives. Washington's main skill at this point is not winning battles. It's not losing so badly that everything collapses, which honestly is underrated leadership. The British, meanwhile, are very confident, almost bored. They assume this rebellion will burn itself out, that the colonies will get tired, that order will be restored. They have professional soldiers, they have funding, they have ships. What they do not have is patience. The early battles are messy, confusing, no clear winners. Washington retreats a lot. This becomes something of a theme. Critics complain, supporters insist it's strategic. Washington nods quietly and keeps retreating anyway. Morale is a constant problem. Soldiers are unpaid, underfed, barefoot. Some of them enlist for short terms and then simply leave, because technically they never signed up for a long nightmare. Congress struggles to fund the war. They argue, they delay, they print money. The money becomes worthless, which is a fun thing to discover while fighting an empire. Washington writes letter after letter asking for supplies. He receives promises. He receives excuses. He receives very little else. And then comes winter, Valley Forge. Now, Valley Forge is often remembered as a moment of heroic suffering, and yes, it was bad. Cold, disease, hunger, but it was also disorganized, poorly managed, and made worse by politics. Washington spends most of this time trying to keep the army together, not inspired, just present. He listens, he endures, he worries constantly that the army will dissolve before spring. Somehow, it doesn't. Training improves, discipline improves, barely. And then something important happens, something international. France begins paying attention. France does not love the colonies. France loves the idea of Britain losing, which, frankly, is enough. Money arrives, weapons arrive, eventually troops and ships arrive. This changes everything. Slowly, quietly. The war becomes global. Britain is now fighting on multiple fronts. Its focus splits. Back in America, the fighting drags on. There are victories, there are defeats. No single moment feels decisive, just years of exhaustion. Civilians suffer, loyalists are harassed, families fracture. Not everyone supports independence. Many people just want stability or safety, or for the shouting to stop. The revolutionaries, for all their talk of liberty, are not always gentle. Pressure is applied. Loyalty is demanded. Idealism has limits when survival is at stake. Washington's reputation slowly improves, not because he's brilliant, but because he's still there. He hasn't collapsed, he hasn't fled, he hasn't turned on Congress, which was a real concern. That alone makes him exceptional. Meanwhile, Britain struggles to adapt. Their commanders disagree, their strategies shift. They underestimate local resistance, they overestimate loyalty. They assume that taking cities will end the rebellion. It does not. They take New York, Philadelphia. The rebellion continues anyway. Because by now, it's not just about laws. It's about pride and identity and the fear of what happens if they lose. The final turning point comes slowly, through attrition, through alliances, through Britain growing tired. Yorktown arrives not as a dramatic climax, but as a realization. Britain is stuck, surrounded, outmaneuvered. Surrender follows, quiet, formal. The war is effectively over, though paperwork will take years. Now comes the part no one enjoys, figuring out what happens next. The colonies have won independence. Congratulations. Now they have to govern themselves, which turns out to be complicated. The men who agreed on independence do not agree on much else. They distrust centralized power. They distrust each other. The Articles of Confederation create a weak government on purpose. No strong executive, no real enforcement. It is freedom-focused and wildly impractical. States argue, debts pile up, soldiers go unpaid. Washington resigns his command, which shocks everyone. He could have taken power. He doesn't. This single act cements his legacy more than any battle. He goes home, to Mount Vernon, to his land, to his slaves. The revolutionaries now face an uncomfortable truth. Winning a war is easier than building a nation. Discontent spreads. Economic hardship follows. Shays' rebellion breaks out. Farmers angry about debt and taxes, the very things the revolution supposedly opposed. The elites panic. They realize they may have created something unstable, something fragile. A stronger government begins to look appealing, even necessary. And so, slowly, reluctantly, they begin to reshape what they built. Which leads us towards constitutions, conventions, compromises. But that is still ahead. For now, let's rest here, in the quiet aftermath, the empire broken, the future uncertain, a revolution won, but not resolved. So, take a breath, let the timeline blur a little, and when you're ready, we'll drift onward into the uneasy peace that followed.
Welcome back. This is the last stretch, the part where everyone is exhausted, the adrenaline is gone, and reality quietly taps the new nation on the shoulder and says, "So, what exactly is the plan here?" We left off with victory, or at least something close enough to victory that people were willing to call it that and go home. The war is over. The British are leaving, slowly, reluctantly, and the United States of America now exists, on paper, in theory. Emotionally, still very fragile. The soldiers return home, many of them unpaid, some of them injured, most of them deeply unimpressed by the gratitude they receive. Promises made during the war are quietly forgotten because budgets, because politics, because it's suddenly very inconvenient to remember them. The economy is a mess. Inflation has eaten through what little currency exists, trade networks are broken, debts are everywhere. The states behave like independent countries because, functionally, they are. They argue about borders, they argue about taxes, they argue about trade, they argue about who owes whom money. Congress, under the Articles of Confederation, watches helplessly. It cannot enforce laws. It cannot collect taxes. It cannot compel cooperation. It can ask nicely, which is not a strong governing strategy. George Washington is watching all of this from Mount Vernon. He is tired. He is aging. He would very much like to stay retired. But people keep writing him letters, long letters, concerned letters. They talk about chaos, about unrest, about the fear that the revolution might eat itself. And then comes Shays' Rebellion. Daniel Shays is a farmer, a former soldier, in debt. He and others like him are facing foreclosure. They are losing their land. They are angry. They rise up. They march. They shut down courts. And suddenly, the elites are terrified, not of monarchy, but of the people. This is the moment when many of the founding figures realize something uncomfortable. They do not trust unchecked democracy. They never really did. They want liberty, but controlled liberty, structured liberty, liberty with guardrails. So they decide to meet, quietly at first, then officially. The Constitutional Convention. Philadelphia, summer, hot, humid, windows closed to keep discussions secret. Inside, the men argue, constantly. Big states versus small states, North versus South, federal power versus state power. Slavery looms over everything. Always present, rarely confronted directly. Compromises are made, uncomfortable ones, calculated ones. Representation is balanced, power is divided, branches of government are created. Checks and balances, because no one trusts anyone else. The presidency is invented carefully, deliberately, strong enough to lead, weak enough to restrain. They are building something new, but they are also terrified of recreating what they just escaped. When the Constitution is finally drafted, it is not universally celebrated. Far from it. Debate erupts. Federalists argue for ratification. Anti-federalists warn of tyranny. Pamphlets fly. Speeches are made. Anxiety is everywhere. Eventually, promises are added. Amendments are proposed. The Bill of Rights. A reassurance. A calming gesture. And slowly, state by state, the Constitution is ratified. The new government begins. George Washington is asked to be president, not elected in the modern sense, chosen, almost unanimously. He does not want the job, which conveniently makes everyone want him more. Washington understands symbolism. He understands restraint. He understands when to step back. His presidency sets precedents. 2 terms, civilian control, peaceful transition. Things that seem obvious now, but absolutely were not then. John Adams follows, which is less calming, more argumentative. Political parties emerge almost immediately, despite everyone insisting they wouldn't. Federalists, Democratic Republicans. Jefferson and Adams turn from allies into rivals, then enemies, then much later, old men writing reflective letters to each other. The revolutionaries age. They retire. They die. The nation grows, unevenly, unequally. Freedom expands for some, not for others. Slavery remains, embedded, protected, avoided. The contradictions harden. And here's the quiet truth of it all. The American Revolution did not end in 1783 or 1789. It never really ended at all. It became a reference point, a story, a myth, a thing people argue about endlessly. Was it about liberty? Yes. Was it about power? Also yes. Was it about taxes? Kind of. Was it about elite interests protecting themselves under the language of universal rights? Often. It was all of it, at the same time. Messy, human, inconsistent. The founders were not demigods. They were men, flawed, brilliant, hypocritical, occasionally insufferable. They created something remarkable and deeply incomplete. And maybe that's why it endured, because it was never finished. So as we let this story settle, let it do so gently. No fireworks, no dramatic swelling music, just a long process, a slow separation, a careful, anxious experiment. An empire dissolving not in a single moment, but through irritation, argument, and exhaustion. And from that, a country emerging. Uncertain, contradictory, still figuring itself out. Which in many ways, it still is. So take a breath. Let the voices fade. Let the timelines soften at the edges. And when you're ready to drift off, remember this wasn't a perfect beginning. It was just a beginning. Good night.